So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. My name is Mohammed Al-Mughayyer. I'm a senior partnership advisor at UNDP. I focus mostly on mobilizing financing for development through the private and public partnership. I'm very pleased today to moderate today's event, Business Call to Action, the 10th annual forum, Reimagining Resilience through Inclusive Business Innovation. Today's topic is very unique, but also close to my heart. It's on the future of private sector in the Sustainable Development Goals, public-private sector partnership for leaving no one behind. Today, I promise you that we are having a very unique panel from across the world that is going to be talking about different issues related to public-private sector partnerships. Now, before I start, I would like you to please use the chat box here to tell us down below where you are chatting from, where you are tuning from, so that we know and we are familiar with the faces that we have online. So please, I encourage all of you to participate. Now, there is no time and no excuse to work in silos when it comes to achieving the SDGs. More than ever, the next decade of action necessitates effective partnership to ensure that by 2030, no one is left behind. In this session, we will aim to promote public-private dialogue as a means to forge and facilitate effective partnership for sustainable development goals, featuring very successful partnership stories from business leaders and public sector champions. This conversation will dive into what is needed for effective multi-actor partnership and walk through how to translate them into action and adapt them into the local context. In this panel, as I promised you, we will have an amazing panelists that are going to be tuning in. From Germany, we have Ms. Uta Bullhoff, the Deputy Director General at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, PMZ. We also have Mr. Paolo Politi, founder and CEO of Move Investmotors. And we also have Ms. Susan Olsen, who's the head of the Private Sector Financial Institution Division Unit for the South Asia Asian Development Bank, ADB. We also have Mr. Jace Rabi, the President and the CEO of Tularo Global Group. Welcome, everybody, to this. What I promise to be is going to be a very fruitful discussion on the private-public partnership. The aim of this session is going to be to present really concrete examples from across the world on effective public partnership for sustainable development goals and inclusive scale, especially how such partnerships have been instrumental responding to the COVID-19 crisis. We will also introduce the Kampala principles as a framework for multi-actor partnerships and how to translate them into action and adapt them to local context. Last but not least, we will also unpack the key ingredients for a successful partnership that is combining both public and private partnerships and the role of inclusive business, in particular, in leaving no one behind. Just for some housekeeping, just to tell you, we will have, as I said, 4 speakers. Each one of them will have about 8 minutes to speak. And then we are going to be going for one question for each of the distinguished panelists. And then after that, I will open the floor for the audience to come up with the questions. And then we are going to conclude. So we have 1 hour from now. And I am going to be starting immediately right away with a number of points. But first, I would like to make an invitation to Ms. Utla Buhoff, the Deputy Director General at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. You know, under the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, the Private Sector Engagement Working Group is led by Germany as a co-chair of the Gpedc and the Business Leaders Caucus, PLC. This multi-stakeholder platform aims to advance the effectiveness of all types of development cooperation and has been mandated to evaluate the challenges, concerns, and views of the stakeholder. Now, regardless of the private sector engagement in development cooperation, leaving no one behind is very central to this agenda. So now I would like to start this discussion by inviting Ms. Uta Bulhoff to present her remarks. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Mohamed, for inviting me. So, you know, as Deputy Director in the ministry, you know, we have been focusing very much on effective partnerships, as you put us right into the topic. We all know achieving the SDGs, we have a scarcity of resources, and the scarcity of resources has even augmented in the period of COVID and may even, you know, further grow. So the need for involving the private sector, which is doing an enormous, you know, part of contributing to achieving the SDG, is all the more important. And given the scarcity, we really need to discuss the effective use of existing resources. And that's, you know, why I really appreciate that panel, you know, to discuss that we have to discuss how the SDGs can become a business case for the private sector and not just, you know, the typical CSR, and where does the financial return come from. And that's why I would really much like you to introduce you to the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, which is a multi-stakeholder partnership from development partners, the private sector, unions, NGOs, international banks. And as you rightly pointed out, there's a particular focus on how to engage and how to involve the private sector. And let me briefly tell you, you know, what has happened and what we're going to do. So what has happened was very much, you know, we looked at 900 case studies all over the world. You know, how does partnerships work on the ground? And these were case studies in Bangladesh and in Egypt and El Salvador and Uganda, you name it. And what we really found was that the need for improved country ownership, the need for focus on sustainable development, the need for more inclusive partnerships, more transparency, as well as accountability and managing the risks for all in the sense of leaving no one behind was essential. And there's a huge demand. So what do? We then assembled very much the private sector leaders around the globe to discuss how can we bring actually the originally developed Busan effectiveness principles on transparency, accountability, to a framework which matches the private sector needs. And this is what you see here on the slide. You know, we really try to also match the language of the private sector and move, you know, what we know from previous effectiveness discussions to really make it tangible on the ground on how should programs be run from private sector to ensure that country ownership is given, that inclusive partnership is given, transparency, and so on and so forth. And what we do now, given that we have developed the Kampala principles, which was actually done in Kampala itself, that's why they were called so, is now, together with the group, global group of private sector volunteers, we currently develop a portfolio of best practices. How can that actually be brought to life? I mean, there's so many tons of examples out there in terms of how we can manage and showcase this. And so this will be made available through social media within the next 9 months. We're currently collecting the case studies all over the world, preparing them with social media support, podcasts, small video clips, and we'll then also use high-level events like this one, but also hopefully next year, the UN week, to really get the outreach to just multiply what good practices have been developed and give the access to everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You know, Ms. Uta Bulhoff, you talked about the Kampala principle as a set of a framework for partnership more than effectively with the private sector in development and cooperation. You also talked about something that is really important, and that is a clear communication between public and private sector, which is really quite missing, and that is really important to highlight. My question to you, I guess, is now, how is the concept of leaving no one behind integrated in this agenda, particularly in the times of COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, that's a topic, which has become much more pressing over the last couple of months, also in a discussion with our private sector partners. And, let me just point out maybe, one or two examples here, which hopefully can illustrate, what we are talking about. And it's, for us overall, it's important to address topics such as food security and decent employment, income poverty, and economic inclusion. And, just as an example to showcase, and that's one of our portfolio cases we currently work on, is together with the Philippines Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which has, of course, Philippines, as many other regions in the world, has been hit really, really hard by COVID, and particularly the young population. So the unemployment rose from January 2020 from 13% to 31% in April. And the Chamber of Commerce took the initiative of developing a program of upskilling and reskilling the labor force, including the unemployed youth, together with the Department of Labor, the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority, the Employees Confederation, and international development partners. So it's exactly what I described earlier in terms of to get this entire partnership moving, but the private sector basically takes the lead. And what I find this case study is very much about is, as you requested, showing it's really concerned about leaving no one behind in the COVID times. But at the same time, of course, like this case study also covers inclusion as well as covers the results and targeted impact. So it's very much about being flexible and agile to be in the moment and adapt to what is needed in order to leave no one behind.
Thank you very much. Now, well, you talked again of something that I find really quite remarkable is the private sector takes the lead in this and to be flexible and to be agile. So we will come back to more discussions, and I will also open the discussion at the end of this session. So colleagues, panelists, and guests, please make sure if you have any questions to put them in the box below so that we can take the questions afterwards. Now, Ms. Uta Bolhoff, the Deputy Director General at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, thank you very much for this. And we will come back to you. Please stay with us. Now, from Germany, we are moving to Brazil to talk to Mr. Paulo Piluti, the founder and CEO of Move Investimentos. You are a member of the Business Leaders Caucus in the Global Partnership, and you have led important impact investing fund in Latin America, as far as I know, that invites the innovative companies to reduce social inequalities and reverse environmental degradation. Now, from your experience, can you tell us how can investors support the development of commercially viable solutions to address development priorities at the local level?
Yes, well, thank you very much for the invitation, Mohammed. It's a pleasure to share a little bit of our experience doing equity investments here in Brazil in companies that besides growing and delivering value, they also try to solve environmental and social problems. So I selected two cases from our portfolio that I want to share with you and the audience today. Let me just share my screen. Please tell me if you can see it properly.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you. Well, the first one is, it's a company called Biophilic. It works in the Amazon region of Brazil. We are present in 5 Brazilian states. And Biophilic business model is forest conservation by producing and selling environmental credits, CO2 credits from avoided deforestation. So you can see some pictures here in terms of the environmental impact that we have, real pictures, the community involvement, and some benefit sharing of the community. So the business model is that we manage areas. We are today managing 1.5 million hectares and growing to 3 million hectares of native forest in Brazil. This area will allow us to avoid more or less 57 million tons of CO2 emissions in the next 10 years. CO2 has a price in the voluntary markets. We sell these credits and we get our return. This company is profitable and growing, and we share benefits with the communities involved. So we are targeting SDG 15.2, which is forest management and regeneration. And we have intense discussions and partnerships with the Brazilian states to develop this type of model in government-owned forests through a public-private partnership. So this is a very interesting model. It's alive now for 10 years and hopefully much more in the future. The second business model that we developed is a company called Tejanova. Tejanova works in urban cities. So in Brazil, you have a lot of this problem. You have 20 million people, more or less, that live in informal settlements. So this is the picture right here below in the left. So Tejanova is a social business. It unlocks land rights for the Brazilian urban poor, avoiding forced evictions, okay? So there is a lot of community involvement. This is a picture of a community voting for an agreement, conflict mediation, because this land is irregularly occupied. Normally there is a landowner claiming and enforcing the eviction of this population. And after this is achieved, the conflict mediation and a ratification of a judicial agreement, people start buying their plots and the municipalities can go in providing infrastructure. So you see here, this in the city of São Paulo, the municipality building pavement, sewage, and water and electricity systems. So this is a company. We work today with 500,000 families. It's a profitable business as well, and we are targeting SG 11.1, which is safe and affordable housing. So this is the examples that concrete examples from our portfolio that I would like to share with you that I think are worthwhile talking about. Thank you.
I see now more questions are coming from the audience, but I'm going to restrict that to the very end. You know, you've talked about managing 1.5 million hectares of native forests in Brazil, and you also talked about some remarkable environmental gains and advancing the SDGs and Agenda 2030. I guess my question is really more related to what type of business models are most suitable to respond to these challenges in your view?
What type of business models are more, well, we run, how do we work? We run a pipeline selection of business models. So we have our first fund, we have 7 investments to do 7 investments, we looked in 5 years for 1,476 companies, business models, all over the country in 3 main areas. One area is resilient cities. Tejanova is a classical example. The second one is education. We have one investment in education, work in 10 Brazilian states. And the third one, sorry, is native forests. So we run a selection. The first question that we ask if the company has an impact, if it's targeting to resolve an important problem in Brazil. We link that to an SDG, and then we go through the process to see if the business model can be healthy and scalable. So if these 2 questions are answered, then we delve in negotiations. We acquire a minority position. We become a shareholder of the company and try to develop this company further. So that's basically what we do.
Well, Mr. Paulo Belluti, founder and CEO of Move Investments, please stay with us. We will come back to you with more questions. And now moving from Brazil to India, I have with us another distinguished panelist, Ms. Susan Olsen, the head of Private Sector Financial Institutions Division Unit for the South Asian Development Bank, the ADB. The ADB supports inclusive business companies targeting some of the low-income markets, creating tangible development impact in Asia and the Pacific, providing technical assistance for the development of inclusive business, ventures and finance mechanism, equity, and debt fund. ADB is also promoting policy work with selected governments as well as knowledge exchange on inclusive business. Now, I guess my question to you, Ms. Olsen, is more related. How are the public-private projects that deliver access to basic service structures to reach and serve low-income population in your portfolio in Asia? Is this something that you feel you can comment on? I know that it's a big question and we have limited time, so but I promise we will come back to you in more detail the question on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. And I'll try to be brief because what I want to try to cover, I guess, is how ADB has been responding this year in a year of such a need to reach low-income, vulnerable segments because of the COVID-19 impact, in a complementary way, but also a differentiated way between our public sector arms and our private sector arms. So while I happen to represent the private sector unit, it's important to mention perhaps that ADB, as one of the multilateral regional development banks catering to its member countries in Asia and the Pacific, we have 40 member countries that borrow. So this is covering everything from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan all the way to Fiji, Samoa, Vanuatu. The needs vary widely across the region. But I think there are 3 governing principles that we've been applying. We always apply, but we've been applying more than ever, perhaps this year, in order to structure our public and our private sector responses through ADB. And those are 1, I'll just go through them quickly and then I'll comment on them in some detail. 1 is how to maximize the volumes that we can bring to the table in a time of such need. 2 is who is being served and how to reach them. And then the 3rd is which risks are we trying to cover? I put just 1 slide up as a backdrop because I think it's important to try and bifurcate how the public sector and the private sector respond to those 3 questions in a different way. But always looking for the same principles. So on the volumes, how much can we bring? This year, ADB has triggered, I guess, some counter-cyclical response so that we can lend more from our own balance sheet. The target for 2020 is 20 billion across the regions, of which 3 is for the private sector. So the private sector is the minor share of what ADB does in terms of volumes. But in every dollar that ADB puts out through its balance sheet, we're always looking to lever partnerships. I know that's one of the themes for the BCTA event today, but certainly it's front and center in everything that we do. So on the public sector side this year, that 20 billion figure that I mentioned, which is mostly for the public sector, there's an 8 billion co-financing target, bringing in other development finance institutions, other governments who want to join in the projects that ADB is supporting to increase the volumes. On the private sector side, for every dollar that ADB puts in of the 3 billion figure that I mentioned, we will always be looking to raise 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 from private commercial banks, from equity funds, from other risk transfer partners who want to share in those risks for us so that we can maximize the total amount deployed. And I just will briefly mention also that because of the need of the most vulnerable segments, which is what we're trying to address through both public and private segments, we do have large grant capacities. So this year, ADB has unlocked the Asia Pacific Disaster Response Fund, which is a $3 billion grant fund that was started to deploy early on March, April for the most immediate sort of food supply needs, emergency health supply needs, really targeted at sort of emergency response needs. I'm repeating the word, but across the markets. And we've also just closed on $4 billion in contributions in grants that are coming in from donor partners who are assigning that resource to ADB for deployment in the building back efforts. So for the more short to medium term exercises where projects need to be structured or capacity needs to be developed, and we do need to utilize some grant resources for that, we can tap into those funds to leverage the money that we're putting into projects. I think the more interesting point from a human perspective is who we're trying to reach and how we do it, because the who is slightly differentiated. I think we recognize clearly at ADB that it's the role of the public sector, of the governments, to reach the extreme poor and the poorest of the poor, really for those vulnerable segments, as well as specifically targeting youth, informal settlements, disabled, other special differentiated groups, and then the groups that would already be mapped in terms of the lowest income, where there doesn't need to be any regard for the market sustainability of the approaches. We would leave that to the funding that's provided through the government. And then it's devolved into, and this is getting to the how, state governments, municipal governments, where you can sort of reach to the best extent possible the last mile to get to the people who need those immediate transfers and social support mechanisms, particularly in rural regions where the logistics capacity is harder. Mind you, there are a number of cases where we have partnerships with the private sector, particularly on the logistics distribution and on that last mile piece. I mean, in an era where I think another cross-cutting theme is that digital payments and the need for digital distribution of social support and social assistance schemes has been prominent in most of the dialogues. Those partners, the payment platform partners, the Paytms in India, for example, or the Bcashes in Bangladesh, those are private sector players. So we've seen some very effective utilization of private sector partners by the public sector to reach those segments. We would leave the low income segments more for the private sector to cover. And I guess maybe that dovetails quickly to the third point that I mentioned earlier, which is which risks are being covered by the public and by the private sector. So we would look again to the public sector through the majority of ADB's lending to do conditional cash transfer schemes, job subsidies to try and keep employment sustained at a time of lockdowns and slow activity on the business side, looking to push more unemployment insurance schemes, micro pension schemes. Those are all programs and policy work that's being done on our government side. Even other aspects like providing domestic violence support or mental health care, and being attentive to those social needs as well that might not otherwise be part of the day-to-day or bread and butter of the public health schemes. The private sector side will come in focusing on more sustainable, scalable, market-based solutions. And we do a lot of that, I guess, for livelihood support. So considering that micro and small businesses comprise, depending on the country we're talking about, at least 90%, it's 90%, 99% of the number of firms, at least in South Asia, it's closer to 99% of the companies are micro and small business. We have a number of programs, such as our microfinance risk participation program, which was just increased this year to 600 million. Number of loans going out, different borrowers, different tickets, different countries, but all focused on making sure that micro and small businesses get access to liquidity because they're really the backbone of economic activity and the source of job creation. So we'll support that livelihood part through the market-based economy with our private sector solutions. We do have a number of other specific programs I can mention that have been launched this year. I mentioned one in the slide, ADB Ventures. It's a program focused on using technology. It's a small program to start, 50 million, but again, looking at supporting scalable business models with high use of technology to be more efficient, to be able to reach underserved segments, rural segments with more efficient cost structures using digital technologies, and focused always on gender impacts, positive social impacts. along that lines, and again, in line with the need to rebuild because of the impacts of COVID-19 on the low-income segments or base of the pyramid, we're also going to be launching a new large-scale 500 million inclusive business program across Asia Pacific, working again through partners who in the different markets have smaller companies who are providing affordable but quality. I think that's where the private sector really distinguishes itself, is in the right price point for low-income markets, but a quality service in affordable housing, in affordable access to education, affordable access to healthcare, diagnostic clinics, et cetera, that are market-based solutions, but really trying to complement what the public sector can do in terms of building out capacity. So those are just a few of the initiatives that we're launching this year in response to COVID-19 and trying to fill some of the large gap that's needed in the inclusive business space.
Well, you talked about who you want to reach through your development work, but also the how, which is really great. You also talked about the logistics, distributions, digital payment, the social assistance schemes, and market-based solutions engaging the private sector. Now, Ms. Susan Olsen from the Asian Development Bank, thank you very much. I'll come back to you with a follow-up questions shortly, but we will have to move into the next distinguished panelists in the interest of the time, but I will come back to you with more questions. And I also have some personally questions that I wanted to raise, but I'm not going to exploit this space, especially on the issues of digital finance that you have highlighted as you were speaking. Now, moving from India to Benin with Mr. Jace Rabi, who's the president of Tularo Global Group. Now, Mr. Rabi, you are heading one of Benin's leading cashew production companies, the Tularo Global. Tularo has a history of support from partnerships with the public sector, including the partnerships with USAID, and increase production and achieve the highest level of food safety certificate in the world, which is quite remarkable. And a partnership with the Agroforestry Technical Assistance Facility to increase your frame network partnerships with other partners and certificate programs, and also with the support from USAID to build a value-added roasting facility, the first of its kind in West Africa, in which several of your farmers groups are actual profit-sharing partners in roasting unit. I guess my question to you is more, can you please tell us more about the importance of public-private partnership in your business and their importance in localizing social and economic impact, please?
Yep, sure. Hello, everybody. I hope everybody's well. You know, the pioneer industries, I'll speak to West Africa first, is there's tremendous opportunity in West Africa, but we're kind of caught in no man's land, if you will. And what I mean by that is traditional banks, for example, in Europe and the US, they find West African investments or many African investments is too risky. So it often pushes any type of financing, whether that's for working capital, whether that is for CapEx for expansion, they push those into the developmental bank sector. Well, typically with developmental banks, we find that their interest rates are simply too high, right? It's very difficult to make a viable business case. So that's where I find so much value in the public-private partnership. What I mean by that is you have groups like GIZ and groups like USAID, USDA that are able to bring financing in terms of grants or low interest loans. They're willing to take the risk because their whole mission, right? Their whole reason for being is simply development in Africa, right? So we're able to piggyback off of some of these partnerships and really accomplish some amazing things. You know, I'll give you an example of the roasting and salting unit that we have built. We did that in partnership with USAID. It was over a $700,000 grant. We then came to the table with the other 50% of the needs. We built a tremendous factory where we're adding value to all of our products. We've tied in thousands of farmers as profit sharing partners. And that project simply would not have been viable if we had to finance the entire thing through local banks or through developmental banks. So the public-private partnerships, when they're able to come to the table with financing and unlocking low-interest loans and grants, really enable us to achieve what we're trying to do here in West Africa. So it's a tremendous value in this really the synergy between two. The public sector is so keen on seeing development, but oftentimes they're limited in their scope on how to accomplish that development. But when they're able to partner with somebody like Tolero, who's a private company, we're really able to do tremendous things. So it's been wonderful. We have had several projects that you alluded to before, and then not to mention, our vision is to develop Benin, right? I mean, and every private company that's in a developing world can say the same thing. Our goal is to develop the communities in which we're in, and that public partnership really enables us to accomplish the goals that we've set forth.
Well, thank you very much. Now, many concrete and great examples, but I also would like to link this more into the Kampala principles, if it's okay. But before I move back to the panelists, I would like to encourage all the participants who are with us to please write down your questions below. We will be taking questions at the end of this session. So in about 10 to 15 minutes from now, we'll be taking questions. But let me go back to Ms. Uta Bolhoff, the Deputy Director General of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. Now, the Kampala principle set a framework for partnering more effectively with the private sector in development cooperation to achieve the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. I guess my question to you is, how is the concept of leaving no one behind integrated in this agenda, particularly in the times of a crisis now at COVID-19? If you can elaborate. I know we asked this question, but it's coming back again. So I'd like you to come back to it if it's possible with one concrete examples, if okay with you.
Yes, thank you very much. It's good to hear that there's a lot of interest in the principles, because I think we all understand that the private sector as such is so diverse, but hopefully the principles can be kind of a focal point of channeling the discussion. And what we as ministry, because I pointed out the example was a Philippine Chamber of Commerce earlier on. What we as a ministry in particular trying to do at this moment is, for instance, the development of stress tests, to mitigate risks in the banking system, in for instance, in Brazil and Mexico. So it's initiatives like emerging market sustainability dialogues, that allow us to move forward with these principles. So I like to leave it like here.
Thank you very much. No, I'm also going back to thank you very much, Ms. Susan Olsen, the head of the Private Sector Financial Institution Division for the South Asia, the ADB. Now, this pandemic threatens to severely set back economic, social, and development gains in Asia and the Pacific, to reverse progress also on poverty reduction and to throw economies into recession. Now, Ms. Susan Olsen, I have a few questions for you, but I'm going to again limit them to very precise questions. Can you tell me more? What are the differences in the role of the private sector and the public-private partnerships in this case? And how were the ADB's financial mechanisms used to address the urgent needs of the sick, the poor, and the vulnerable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thanks, Mohammed. Uta used the word risk, and I think it's important to mention, especially speaking
Susan, I think we are losing you for a few seconds. we lost you for a moment, so I'm just going to go. I'll come back to you, Susan, on the questions. I think there is an issue with the internet connection, but let me go back to Mr. Jace Rabi, the president of Tularo Global Group. You have spoken in the past about a communication divide between the public and the private sector that prevents effective partnership from being formed. Now, do you feel that there has been improvement in the communication gap now? And how can such communication gaps be overcome in the public-private sector partnerships to achieve full impact and scale?
Yeah, unfortunately not. I don't see any improvement in the communication gap. What we have done in the private sector, well, I can't speak for the whole private sector, but for Tularo is we've simply had to start learning how to speak the public language so we could tie into the public assistance. There's still very much a breakdown in communication between the public sector and the private sector. I think I've changed my views a little bit. I think that the public sector definitely has the desire to see development, but I think that we're coming at it from two different sides of the equation. I think at the end of the day, we want to accomplish the same things, but we speak very different languages. But the way that we have adapted and pivoted is to try to learn some of the public sector language, right, and engage at that level. So I can't expect everybody to understand and operate the same way we would, but at the end of the day, we're entrepreneurs and we have clear objectives and goals, and we see the public sector as a huge opportunity and a valuable partner, and therefore we need to oftentimes make that bridge to be able to have successful partnerships.
Great, thank you very much. Now, Susan, if you are still with us, I will come back to this question. How were the ADB's finance mechanism used to address the urgent needs of the sick, the poor, and the vulnerable? Can you also comment on what are the differences in the role of the private and the public sector in this case? I think we may have lost you, Susan, in this call, so I'll just carry on, and if you come back, I'm going to be picking up another set of questions. Let me go back to this question. I'm going to go back to this question now, which comes from the audience. Now, as a follow-up to this question from the audience, how can we incentivize or encourage collaboration with those private sector companies which may not already have impact built within their business network? It's an open question for everybody. So if anybody would like to come in and comment on that, you are more than welcome.
Well, maybe I can pick that up a bit, Mohammed. I think the incentive for the traditional companies is related to show to them that it's a good business case over the long term. That is good for the culture, it's good for the resilience of the organization, and it's good for the stakeholder engagements, for financing. And long term, I think the organization turns out to be more innovative, resilient, and healthy. So the way to do that is, in my view, show concrete examples and show that it's possible to do it. It's not a short-term road. It's a long-term trajectory. So that's my opinion.
Yes, thank you very much. And maybe if we have Susan back, I'm still insisting to have you come on board with us if you're still with us.
Hi, Mohammed. The power went out, so I apologize for the interruption. The generator is on now.
No problem. So did you get my question?
I think you were asking, what ADB is doing, how we're trying to address the needs of the poor and the vulnerable. And again, I'll answer that separating the role of the public sector and the private sector, because the answers are slightly different for each. On the public sector side, we really do try and work closely with our member governments to decide what they need the most. I mean, of the 20 billion that's going to be lent this year for COVID response, obviously the proportion depends on the size of the country. India's taken a $4 billion loan, for example. Myanmar's taken 250 million, and very specifically working with them to see how the needs of the most vulnerable segments are going to be met. So looking at rural areas, looking at women, children, and basic healthcare needs, basic food security needs, and working through the different mechanisms to make sure that deliveries happen. So there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes as well to make sure that procurement is done well, and lots of targets that are set, right, to make sure that the funding is going and we're tracking how it's meeting the needs that have been identified so that the money is well utilized. On the private sector side, I'd say the focus is not only on reaching the low income segments, but also making sure that the overall private sector ecosystem works as well. So in my first response, I was mentioning a few specific programs where we're working through the private sector, kind of working bottom up, company by company, partner by partner, building on and scaling solutions that are available, whether it's, for example, a company called Avast that we recently supported with a $60 million loan. They only focus on affordable housing for economically weak, low income groups in India. And we're looking for targets there where women are the head of household or women are the co-borrowers on those loans. So trying to get to the who needs the support, but working company by company, working through this new inclusive business partnership that I mentioned with partners, getting to smaller companies who are scaling commercially viable business models. But it's important to mention some of the other, what I call ecosystem building activities as well. For example, we have a new 250 million supply chain finance program that was launched this year during the pandemic. And knowing that a lot of the challenges in getting supplies and need to the most vulnerable segments rely on private sector distribution, that program is specifically working with anchor companies in the pharmaceuticals or in the healthcare segment or in the food production business, in the agribusiness segment. And the angle of impact that we can address through those kinds of supply chain linkages is making sure that more micro and small businesses get access to credit so that they can continue their economic activity, continue to produce and generate and have that last mile distribution capacity, but doing it through a supply chain partnership program and working through the anchor firms. Bottom up, company by company, but always focused on trying to meet a social need, whether it's primarily micro small businesses, whether it's women, whether it's rural, underserved, sort of tier 2, tier 3 towns that don't have access to quality healthcare, quality education, finding the right private sector partner who can meet those needs so that we can back them.
Thank you, Susan. Now, I'm mindful of the time. We have about 10 minutes, and I'm receiving so many questions here. So I guess my next question is to Mr. Jace Rabi. Now, the question goes like this: don't you fear that such a grant could create a distortion to the market? Your firm and the farmers you work with have access to loans at low interest rate, while the majority, unfortunately, still don't.
No, not at all, actually, because I view, Tolero Global, for example, isn't a nonprofit. What I mean by that is we don't require, for example, if I take a roasting and salting facility, okay, in which public funds provided half that cost. That factory itself is now viable and is producing nearly 70% of our revenue of our total group, right? So the profit distributions going to farmers out of that factory are now sustainable, right? I no longer require additional funds to run that factory, right? My current working capital needs provide everything that we need. So no, I don't view it that way. I think distortion would come about if there was a consistent, if we had built a business model that is based on low interest loans from public sources or continual investments on a year in and year out basis, then absolutely we would not be creating a sustainable business model. But these are one-off grants that really kind of inject the capital that we need to launch a sustainable business, and then Tolero is responsible for carrying that into the future. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Yes, absolutely. Mr. J. Srevi, thank you very much. Now, moving back to Germany, we have Ms. Uta Bulhoff, the Deputy Director General. There is a question for you here, and how could the Gpedc platform be more localized at the national level to ensure more effective country implementation of the SDGs?
Thank you for that question, and I think it's exactly one of the topics we are currently trying, to address. When I talk about, what's the next steps in terms of producing that portfolio of best practice cases in terms of how we apply that principles. And I think it also links back to Paulo's comment earlier on in terms of how to get more private sector companies, really focusing that impact builds into the business model. So I think, once we develop that portfolio, that is very much linked to, local examples. So hopefully by, leveraging this time, the power of digital, we really get the outreach, also leveraging a lot of fora that are internationally there, but also, working closely with, existing business alliances, also the very prominent Secretary General's Alliance on Sustainable Development Financing. That is something, where I think that could happen. But then, of course, I think everybody is invited, and we have a lot of, at least government partners that, my peers are in the very regions where it is important to then bring what the global partnership has developed to a local discussions with the chambers of commerce, with unions that are on the ground, with the social society. And I know we have the social society as part. They even have an own chair in the global partnership. And they are extremely vital in order to bring that discussion to the region. So I can only encourage this to move on.
Right, thank you, Ms. Uta Bulhoff, very much for that. We're moving now, getting more questions, and I'll move to a general question that's open for all the panelists here. Now, speaking of the power of digital, access to technology is a big barrier for local private sector to invest. How can we lift such barriers? And how are you at your organizations or companies facilitating access to technology? I guess I will give this a question first to Paulo, but I will also invite Susan to comment on that later on.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I guess this is related to the regions we operate here in Brazil. I mean, in the Amazon, this is quite a big challenge to get access to technology and data, internet infrastructure. So in one of the examples that I showed you, like Biophilic, it's interesting because one of the first things that the communities, when they receive cash from the sale of red credits, they normally invest in satellite internet services. This is the first thing that they do. And the second thing is that they buy computers, laptops, and tablets. So this is an interesting dynamic that we see there. In the urban cities, this is quite different. That we don't have that issue, at least here in Brazil, in Brazilian urban cities, access to technology is quite widespread for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going back to India. Susan, is this something that you feel you can comment on? I know that we have limited time. We have about 4 minutes. So if you can take a minute, I would very much appreciate if you can address this.
Sure. I think we are seeing the need even more clearly now, obviously, because of COVID-19. So our three-pronged approach to what we do directly, I guess, is trying to cover the spectrum of technology needs. I mean, on the one hand, we have the news program that I mentioned earlier, ADB Ventures, which is designed to invest itself in companies that are early stage, more seed stage, early stage scaling, technology-driven models with inclusive impact. We also have an operation, a program that we run to invest in funds. So we would invest in companies like Paulo's for the fund manager to then make those investments and have more capacity to distribute the resources to more technology companies, knowing that some of those fund managers have the best capacity to identify promising technologies and promising companies and promising entrepreneurs who can scale the kinds of technological solutions that the market needs. And I guess the third area is through our own direct investments. I mean, when we're supporting a financial institution, for example, which is what I do directly every day, if before COVID, they didn't have an articulated response to what their fintech strategy is or what their digital strategy is, they need to have a very clear strategy now. And we do provide, in addition to our loan or our investments, we do provide them with some technical assistance so that the companies that we can support can improve their use of technologies and the ways that technologies can help their business be more inclusive, because ultimately it's a cost competitiveness factor and it's an inclusion prerogative to be able to reach more people through technology.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Susan. You know, as we know, the private sector provides 90% of jobs in developing countries and receives 85% of the spending on goods and services. Widespread development is simply not possible without this sector and partnership. Now, I'm also mindful of the time, so I guess we will come to an end of this. But before I come to an end of this, I would like to ask all the panelists to please open their cameras again. Yes. I guess we have heard quite a lot of regional and sectoral diversity today, and I am personally learning a lot from this session and chat and all the panelists that have discussed. I really wanted to take this opportunity to thank everybody who participated in this, and thank you for your patience with us and also flexibility. This is a new virtual forum for us, so it's a new way of engaging. Hopefully that COVID-19 is not going to continue for longer, and we will come back to New York, all of us, the panel, in physically presence, all of us, hopefully with more of the audience. But allow me to take this opportunity to thank all of you for the flexibility, the patience, the knowledge that you have shared. And for that moment, I also wanted to thank particularly the audience that have sent, and also apologize for not taking all the questions. I know it's a very limited time of 1 hour, so I'm afraid that we will just have to leave it there. But the question of public-private sector is not ending. It's still evolving. We want to keep the conversation. BCTA will continue to be the platform for all the private sector companies to continue to share knowledge and exchange practices, but also to acknowledge the work that has been done to advance the SDGs and Agenda 2030. So from my end here, from UNDP side, from Business Call to Action, I thank all the panelists and the participation. And have a lovely day, have a lovely evening, and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you.